Hello, and thanks for watching this video on the SBTi's Net-Zero Standard. In this video, which is one of several that we are including for our public consultation, I'll be discussing emissions abatement and residual emissions in the context of the SBTi's Net-Zero Standard, covering some key background as well as consultation questions that we would love your feedback on. I'll start by reviewing some of the guiding principles and how they relate to the emissions abatement criteria laid forth. Next, I'll move on to the specific emissions abatement target setting method and criteria as they relate to both interim science-based targets and the net zero targets that companies are getting validated by the SBTi. And last, I'll review the consultation questions that we want your feedback on. So to start with a quick review of guiding principles for net zero, these are discussed in more detail in the Foundations of Net Zero video that's part of this series. So I would also recommend watching that. There are three main principles that were laid out in the Foundations for Net Zero Target Setting in the Corporate Sector publication that we released last fall. I'm not going to review each of the three principles word for word, but the first principle is focused on companies balancing their unabated emissions with removals. The second is that companies should transition toward net zero in line with appropriate mitigation pathways. And the third is that the mitigation strategy followed by the company should inform long-term strategies and investments that mitigate exposure to climate-related transition risks and that ensure the business model of the company will continue to be viable in a net zero economy. Now, the second and third principles here do relate more to emissions abatement than the first principle. So I'll move into those directly. What does it mean for companies to transition to net zero in line with 1.5 degree pathways? Companies are already setting 1.5 degree aligned science-based targets, which are focused on emissions reductions in scopes 1, 2, and 3, without the use of offsets or carbon credits to support those emissions reductions. What you can see on the chart on the right is the global emissions pathway that's needed to preserve a 1.5 degree budget based on scenarios in the IPCC's latest report. This text is drawn from the SBTi's Foundations of Science-Based Target Setting paper, basically making clear that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, near-term emissions reductions are quite urgent at the economy-wide level. The third principle, which is focused on business model viability in a net zero economy, relates more to the emissions abatement that is needed at the end point or once a company has reached a science-based state of net zero. And you can see on the right a demonstrative example of a company that might not be reducing its emissions in line with a Paris-aligned emissions trajectory, and that tries to neutralize it with a greater amount of carbon removals. In some cases, this would not be enough because it actually wouldn't ensure that the company's business model is viable in a net zero economy. For one, there are only a limited volume of carbon removals that are actually feasible or possible within the biogeochemical constraints of our planet. Because carbon removal is often very energy intensive, it can be land intensive, and these are limitations that we've discussed in our Foundations for Net Zero Target Setting paper. In another instance, in terms of the example you can see on the left here, you can imagine a case where a car manufacturer plans to neutralize its unabated emissions instead of reducing the emissions associated with internal combustion engine vehicles. Yet in a net zero economy, consumer preferences, air quality regulations, and policy might actually make this business model not viable at all. And we do have a way of understanding this from scenarios and pathways that have been generated by the scientific community. Now I'll move on to the net zero target setting model itself. This is a simplified diagram of what that could look like. And the first thing that we're asking companies to do is to set interim science-based targets. Currently, these are the 5 to 15-year science-based targets that companies have been setting through the SBTi. In the criteria, companies might need to set SBTs that meet specific leadership criteria, for example, that go beyond the minimum requirements that are currently accepted by the SBTi. That could mean greater scope 3 coverage. It could mean 1.5 degree aligned targets only, whereas the SBTi currently accepts targets that are rated as both 1.5 degree aligned and well below 2 degree aligned. More on that a bit later. It also means companies should set net zero targets that include deep decarbonization of value chain emissions paired with carbon removals that neutralize all unabated emissions in the year of net zero. I'll discuss the criteria that are required for emissions abatement in this net zero target year in this presentation as well. Optional compensation is also recommended but not required under the framework for companies to compensate for unabated emissions during their transition to net zero. And this is addressed in another video. What do these different levers or mitigation tactics really mean? I would encourage you to watch the foundations video to get a more in-depth description, but it is laid out in this diagram, and today, in this video, we'll be focused on emissions abatement specifically, which are measures that companies take to prevent, reduce, or eliminate sources of emissions within a company's value chain. So again, this is not interchangeable with the use of carbon credits. First, I'll take you through the emissions abatement criteria for a company's interim SBT during the transition to net zero. The main question here that many of you might want to know is how to calculate the minimum ambition of interim SBTs. The SBTi currently has two main target setting methods, and they each conform to these three main steps, starting with a global carbon budget and emissions scenario, moving on to an allocation approach, and then inputting some company-specific information to understand exactly how much companies need to reduce their emissions. Those methods are absolute contraction and intensity convergence. The first one is applicable to any company. It's a one-size-fits-all method where companies need to reduce their emissions at the same rate as global emissions need to be reduced. The other method is intensity convergence, which only really applies to homogeneous sectors or activities because it's focused on the emissions intensity of some sort of physical process or activity, such as steel production, cement production, or transportation. You can see two examples of absolute and intensity targets on this slide, and it's possible that these targets would result in the same thing depending on the company's projected business activity change. So on the left, a company could set a target to reduce its emissions 50% in absolute terms. On the right, a company could set a target to reduce the emissions intensity of electricity generation or any physical process by an amount that is in line with our methods and scenarios by a certain target year. Another key point is that the SBTi currently assesses scope 1 and 2 targets that fall into two different ambition categories, well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. The SBTi also, when it started, assessed 2-degree aligned targets, which are less ambitious, and for scope 3 emissions reduction targets, still allows 2-degree alignment. So in this table, you can see the actual minimum ambitions associated with these categories. So a company that's aligning with well below 2 degrees would be reducing its emissions by a linear annual rate of 2.5% per year. So that would be 25% over a 10-year time span. For a 1.5 degree aligned target, it would be 4.2% linear annual reduction. Again, this is the absolute contraction method, and we also have an SDA method available, which is the intensity convergence method. And currently, most sectors only have a well below 2 degree aligned intensity pathway available based on the IEA's ETP 2017 B2DS scenario. And there is also a 1.5 degree aligned pathway, intensity pathway for power companies because electric utilities actually must use the intensity convergence method instead of absolute contraction because electricity has to decarbonize faster than the global average. Now we have some consultation questions on this slide focused on the minimum ambition of interim science-based targets. The SBTi is considering changing the minimum ambition from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees for companies to be eligible to set a net zero target with this standard. So we are asking for your feedback on whether you think that we should make this change or not for companies setting net zero targets, and if so, whether the minimum ambition of all SBTs should be increased to 1.5 degrees when we make the next update to our criteria in 2022. Another question we're asking is whether the minimum ambition of interim SBTs should be increased to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees as well, which would be an even larger ratchet from our current range of options, because at the moment, there's a wider range of methods available for scope 3 than for scope 1 and 2, not all of which can be said to be 1.5 or well below 2 degree aligned. So this would be a relatively important change. I would also recommend that you watch our scope 3 video, which will discuss scope 3 target setting methods in more detail, as well as topics related to the scope 3 target setting boundary. The next question that I'll go over in this video is how to calculate emissions abatement consistent with reaching net zero. So this is once a company has set its interim SBT and is moving on to a net zero target, how can that company know that the emissions abatement associated with its target meets the criteria? First, I want to review the concept of residual emissions. According to scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, most of the emissions our economy generates today will have to be eliminated by mid-century. However, there are some residual emissions that remain unabated by the time net zero is reached. Some of those emissions continue to be reduced throughout the second half of the century after net zero is reached. Others remain unabated throughout the 21st century due to technical or economic constraints. Now, those residual emissions are the ones that aren't eliminated by the time that global net zero is reached. And we know that in some sectors, emissions need to go to absolute zero and we'll have no residual emissions at all. For example, that might be the case in the electricity sector. In the foundations paper and draft criteria that we've laid out, we are saying that 1.5 degree line mitigation pathways with no or limited overshoot should be the basis for determining the level of residual emissions for different activities and sectors of the economy that can essentially be used for a company's net zero target. So when we look at the question of emissions abatement at net zero, how much do companies need to reduce emissions? Compared to the 5 to 15 year interim science-based target setting approach, where minimum ambition is expressed as a reduction rate. To be consistent with net zero, companies might need to be reducing their emissions by an overall amount. And this amount would be consistent with the amount that emissions are reduced between some reference year like 2020 and the year that global net zero is reached. This is still a preliminary target setting method that we are exploring. But what it would mean, for example, is that if global emissions are reduced by 90% between 2020 and the year of net zero, that would also be the amount that companies would need to be reducing their emissions in that same, well, in the time frame that it takes for them to reach net zero. The other option is intensity convergence, and similarly, there's a comparison on this slide between what it looks like for 5 to 15 year SBTs and one way it could look for emissions abatement targets that are part of a company's net zero target. So with the SBTi's current emissions intensity target setting method, a company's emissions intensity is drawn to the emissions intensity of some sector or activity over time. And if this option were applied to net zero, instead of there being a gradual convergence, a company could, for example, actually reach the emissions intensity of that sector once global emissions are at net zero. So to review, what this means is that value chain emissions need to be abated by an amount consistent with gross emissions reductions achieved at global net zero in 1.5-degree aligned pathways. And we do plan to include both general, universal, and sector or activity-specific target setting methods to be available here, and for both absolute and intensity targets to be eligible. We have a few consultation questions focused on this topic. One of them is whether you agree that absolute and intensity targets should be eligible to fulfill the emissions abatement criteria for net zero targets. And we would ask that you do some reading into the SBTi's Foundations of Science-Based Target Setting paper if you're interested in knowing more about the intensity target setting method and the absolute contraction method that we use. We also are asking companies whether they agree with our definition of residual emissions laid out here, and whether you are aware of approaches to determine residual emissions at the sector or activity level that could be useful in the guidance for this framework. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you tune in to our other videos and contribute your feedback to the consultation. We look forward to it. Thanks.